In the year 1811, fear spread across the plantations of Louisiana. Hundreds of enslaved men began marching through the night. They carried axes, knives, farm tools, and burning torches. Plantations were attacked. Slave owners fled into the darkness. Now, for the first time in American history, a massive slave army was forming along the Mississippi River. Their goal was simple: freedom. But what followed would become one of the most violent and terrifying uprisings ever seen in the United States. And when it was over, the punishment would be so brutal that the story was almost erased from history. Welcome to Dark History Files, where we uncover the darkest and most disturbing stories buried deep in history. Tonight's story is about the largest slave revolt ever recorded in the United States, the sugar plantations. In the early 1800s, the land along the Mississippi River in Louisiana Sugar was one of the most profitable crops in the world, dominated by sugar plantations. But producing it required enormous amounts of labor. Thousands of enslaved men and women were forced to work in the fields from sunrise until night. The work was brutal: cutting sugar cane with sharp blades under the burning sun, carrying heavy bundles across muddy fields, working inside boiling sugar houses filled with smoke and heat. Many enslaved workers did not survive long under such conditions. Punishments were harsh. Whippings were common. And plantation owners constantly feared one thing: rebellion, because most of the enslaved workers outnumbered their masters. In some areas, enslaved people made up nearly 90% of the population. If they ever rose up together, the plantations could quickly fall. And by the year 1811, something dangerous was already happening. Across the plantations, whispers were spreading. Stories of revolution. Stories of enslaved people who had fought their masters and won. Many of these stories came from the Haitian Revolution. In Haiti, enslaved people had overthrown their colonial rulers and created a new nation. For slave owners across the Americas, this was terrifying news. But for enslaved workers in Louisiana, it was hope. And among those workers was a man who would soon change history. His name was Charles Deslandes. Within weeks, he would lead hundreds of enslaved men into one of the largest uprisings the United States had ever seen. The night the rebellion began. On a cold night in January of 1811, the quiet plantations along the Mississippi River were about to face something their owners had feared for years: rebellion. The uprising began at the plantation of a wealthy slave owner named Manuel Andre, located along what was known as the German Coast, an area of plantations just outside New Orleans. Late that night, a group of enslaved men secretly gathered near the plantation buildings. They had been planning this moment for weeks. Their leader was Charles Deslandes, an enslaved driver who worked on the plantation. Because of his position, Deslandes had access to many parts of the estate. He knew the routines of the overseers. He knew when the plantation house would be vulnerable. And on that night, the rebels finally acted. The men moved quickly through the darkness. Armed with axes, knives, and farm tools, they stormed the plantation house. Shots were fired. The owner, Manuel Andre, was attacked during the struggle. Although he survived the attack, he was seriously wounded and managed to escape. His son, however, was killed during the rebellion. Once the plantation house was taken, the rebels began gathering weapons. They also freed other enslaved workers from nearby cabins. With each passing hour, their numbers began growing. Soon dozens of men had joined the uprising, then hundreds. The rebels began marching down the river road. As they moved from plantation to plantation, they recruited more enslaved workers. Some joined willingly. Others joined out of fear. Behind them, buildings were set on fire. Plantations burned in the night. Witnesses later described the terrifying sight of a growing army of enslaved men marching through the darkness with torches and weapons. Their destination was clear. They were heading toward New Orleans, the most important city in the region. If they could capture the city, the rebellion could spread across Louisiana. For the plantation owners watching their world collapse around them, the fear was overwhelming. Because for the first time, the enslaved population was rising together, and the rebellion was only beginning. The slave army marches. As the fires from the plantations lit the night sky, the rebellion continued to grow. The group led by Charles Deslandes marched steadily along the river road beside the Mississippi River. What had started as a small uprising was quickly becoming something much larger. With every plantation they passed, more enslaved men joined the rebellion. Some carried axes taken from the fields. Others held knives, clubs, or sharpened tools. Many had no weapons at all, but they marched with the others determined to fight for freedom. Witnesses later described seeing a long line of rebels moving through the night. Some reports claimed the group had grown to nearly 500 men. For the plantation owners in the region, this was a terrifying sight. An armed slave army marching toward New Orleans. As the rebels moved forward, they continued setting plantations on fire. Smoke filled the night sky. Buildings burned behind them as they advanced. But despite their growing numbers, the rebels faced a serious problem. They lacked firearms. Most of their weapons were simple tools taken from the plantations. Meanwhile, word of the uprising spread quickly. Plantation owners rode through the countryside warning their neighbors. Messengers were sent to New Orleans. Local militia units were called to arms. Soon, armed soldiers and plantation militias began organizing to stop the rebellion. They understood the danger. If the rebels reached New Orleans, the entire region could fall into chaos. So the authorities prepared to confront the rebel army before it could reach the city. By the next day, armed militia forces began gathering along the river road, and the rebels marching toward New Orleans were about to face a much stronger enemy. The battle on the river road. By the morning of January 10th, 1811, the rebellion had spread across several plantations along the Mississippi River. The rebel army, led by Charles Deslandes, continued marching toward New Orleans. Behind them, burned plantations and destroyed buildings marked their path. But while the rebels were advancing, another force was gathering. Plantation owners, local militia, and armed soldiers. Many slave owners in the region quickly organized their own militias. They were joined by official troops sent from New Orleans. These forces were heavily armed. They carried muskets, rifles, and cavalry weapons. Their mission was simple: stop the rebellion before it could grow any larger. The confrontation came near the plantation of Bernard-Bernoudi, where militia forces finally caught up with the marching rebels. The battle that followed was brief but violent. The rebels fought back using the weapons they had: axes, knives, clubs, but they were badly outmatched. The militia opened fire with muskets. Shots echoed across the sugar fields. Many rebels fell during the first moments of the attack. Others tried to retreat into the nearby swamps and forests, but the militia continued pursuing them. Within hours, the rebel army had been scattered. Some escaped into the wilderness, but many were captured. The uprising that had terrified Louisiana was now collapsing, and for those who had been captured, the punishment that followed would become one of the most brutal responses to a slave revolt in American history. The brutal punishment. After the rebel army was defeated, the authorities moved quickly to restore control across the plantations of Louisiana. Militia forces spread out across the countryside searching for escaped rebels. Many of the enslaved men who had fled into the swamps were hunted down over the next several days. Some were captured hiding in forests. Others were discovered trying to return quietly to the plantations. But the punishment that followed was far more brutal than anyone expected. Plantation owners and local officials wanted to send a message. They believed the rebellion had to be crushed so completely that no enslaved person would ever dare attempt another uprising. Captured rebels were brought before special courts made up of plantation owners and local authorities. These trials were extremely quick. Many lasted only a few minutes. The verdict was almost always the same: execution. Some of the rebels were shot, others were hanged. But the most horrifying punishment was reserved for the leaders of the revolt. The rebel leader Charles DeLong was captured by plantation owners. Instead of being given a trial, he was brutally tortured. Witnesses later reported that DeLong was beaten, shot, and burned alive as punishment for leading the uprising. The violence did not stop there. To terrify the enslaved population, plantation owners displayed the severed heads of the executed rebels along the river road. Dozens of heads were placed on wooden poles. They stretched for miles along the Mississippi River plantations. Anyone traveling through the region would see the grim warning. The message was clear: rebellion would be met with unimaginable cruelty. Historians estimate that nearly 100 rebels were killed in the aftermath of the uprising. The revolt that had once threatened the plantations of Louisiana had been crushed completely. But even though the rebellion failed, the story of the uprising would never completely disappear. Because the men who marched toward New Orleans in 1811 had done something that terrified slave owners across America. They had proven that the enslaved were willing to fight for their freedom. The rebellion history tried to forget. After the executions ended, the plantations along the Mississippi River slowly returned to their normal routines. The burned buildings were rebuilt. The fields were planted again. And the enslaved population was forced back to work. But the fear of rebellion never completely disappeared. The uprising of 1811, known today as the German Coast Uprising, had shaken the slave-holding society of Louisiana. For plantation owners, the revolt had revealed a terrifying truth. The enslaved population greatly outnumbered them. If enough people rose together, the system of slavery could collapse. Because of this fear, many slave owners tried to erase the memory of the revolt. They avoided writing about it. Some historical records were never preserved. Others were intentionally minimized. For years, the story of the largest slave revolt in American history remained largely hidden. But historians eventually uncovered the truth. Nearly 500 enslaved men had marched through the Louisiana plantations. They had fought for freedom. They had challenged a brutal system that had controlled their lives. And although the rebellion was crushed, it became part of a long history of resistance against slavery. Events like the German Coast Uprising showed that enslaved people never simply accepted their condition. Across plantations, cities, and ships, acts of resistance continued throughout the centuries. And those acts of courage eventually contributed to the growing movement that would challenge slavery itself. The Revolt of 1811 stands as one of the most dramatic moments in the history of slavery in the United States. Hundreds of enslaved men risked their lives in a desperate attempt to gain freedom. Their march toward New Orleans became the largest organized slave uprising ever recorded in the country. Although the rebellion ended in violence and tragedy, it revealed something powerful. Even under the harshest oppression, the desire for freedom could not be extinguished. History is filled with stories that powerful people tried to hide. Stories of resistance, stories of courage, stories that reveal the darker side of the past. Here on Dark History Files, we uncover the forgotten events buried deep within history. Stories that remind us how people struggled, resisted, and fought against injustice. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe to Dark History Files, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think might have happened if the rebels had reached New Orleans? Let us know your thoughts. And until the next story, thank you for watching.